Hi friends, host Eric here, host Talking with Fan People, and this is the second part of a video. I may not put the first part of it up. The first part was kind of a recap of recent notions, but what this video, what that was trying to set the table for was this idea of how what makes cognitive functions a challenge is that, like most things in life, what's most important is to ask the right questions. You can't possibly get the right answers if you don't ask the right questions. So, and with cognitive functions, if you're asking all the right questions, then you don't need to ask those questions. You already know the answers. This is the catch-22. So, for example, if you're going to ask about, say, TE, to ask the question about it correctly requires you to say something like this. If I were the observer and observing an individual using the attentional manner, paying attention via extroverted thinking, in a context in which they're working on something where there's no third party there, what would I observe that would be indicative of TE being used? Or, but instead we ask questions like, what's an example of bad TE? Well, there are 4 kinds of paying attention: knowing, deliberating, acting, and interfacing. And each of them requires questions that incorporate the perspective shift accordingly. So, if you want to know what somebody using extroverted intuition looks or sounds like, well, that's relatively easy to tell you. If you're a third party observing somebody using extroverted intuition, it looks and sounds a lot like this. It's somebody talking a lot, and more importantly, trying to produce or present original ideas, at least ideas that are newly informative, at least, to something, right? So it's easy to describe what the cognitive function of extroverted intuition looks like when someone else is using it, because it sounds like somebody talking about ideas a lot and coming up with possible ideas and presenting them as either good, bad, or interesting, or boring, or whatever, right? That's because it's an action function that's communicative. So it only exists in the external world as something you can clearly describe. It doesn't have a silent, externalized form, right? So, now if you were to ask instead, what does it look like when somebody's using introverted intuition? The answer is, it doesn't look like anything. Because introverted intuition is paying attention exclusively to the externalities, it occurs exclusively internally. If you ask a question like, well, what's an example of good NI look like? What you're really saying is, if somebody has used introverted intuition to good effect and produced some sort of artifact that carries with it the history of that good intuition by virtue of its own identity having been manifest so well, then what would that look like? Well, you'd say something like, an example of good NI is #no dry bites, which is an idea. No dry bites is a saying my daughter says, because she refers to herself as a saucer, right? She likes to put a lot of sauce on things. So, no dry bites is a little NI punch expressing that concept. Wall is NI. You know, it's like saying lol conveys conceptually to somebody, I acknowledge the funniness of your thing that you said, or whatever. Or I will fill that role of acknowledging that so that you know that we're still being non-adversarial. So if you're talking about, say, TI, what does an example of TI look like when somebody else is using TI? Well, that one's a little bit more challenging than NE, because the deliberation part is generally done internally. When I started this video, it was after I'd been thinking for quite some time without making a video, without speaking out loud. So, but what we can note about the expression of TI externally is that, like FI, it's likely to ask questions. It wants to have externalities, people especially, render their own positions and or feelings or whatever into a status, and thereby let the individual who is using the TI or FI be better empowered to make determinations about what they're deliberating about, right? So if I'm trying to figure out whether you're right or wrong about something, I'm going to ask you questions about what you mean when you say this. Do you mean this or this? I'm going to try to pin you down on something specific so that I can do work now without worrying about that thing moving. If I'm an FI user, I might try to pin you down by saying, but do you really love me? Or something like that. How do you really feel? Blah, 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 blah. That's an area of inherent, unavoidable weakness for me. I will never be able to understand my polar function very well, even though I'm an expert at understanding things. Because, you know, FI isn't about understanding, it's about your own self-interests. So when we ask questions about cognitive functions or personality type, if we're asking the question in the right way, then that means we already understand that to analyze cognitive functions adequately, we must establish the perspectives when we ask our questions. You want to know about TI as it's experienced by a person using it. Like, in other words, what's your internal dialogue as you're using TI? What it looks like when it's externalized with language. In other words, how is somebody with TI and MIA slot going to perform on this test? Or whether you're going to be asking about what's an example in the world of an artifact of good or bad TI. In other words, evidence left behind of someone's TI being already completed, done before, right? And we gotta always remember that every attentional manner is, in its essence, part of a configural component of an individual being themselves. So there is no attention that's paid externally. I mean, there's no attention being paid outside of a person paying it. There's no FE in the world. There are just people who are attending via FE. We shorthand a lot of these things. So I might say, that's bad TE about some app that Rachel has that has a shitty map interface. Because essentially it's making it hard for me to get from point A to point B rather than efficient to get to point A to point B. I'm going to experience it as someone else's bad TE, and I'm going to shorthand it as such. But if I were going to be precise in my language, I'd experience it as the artifact of somebody, of someone's SE that reveals a deficit of TE in the completion of the whole project, or something like that, you know. It's not critically important we be that precise with our language all the time, but it is important that we recognize when we're being precise and when we're being imprecise. And the problem is, in status quo, when I'm trying to explain cognitive functions to people, I'm always having to start with, okay, I can either choose to answer this question as it's meant if it were to have been stated precisely, or I can answer this question by addressing the fact that the question should have been stated differently to be more precise, or I can answer the question by saying, instead of answering that question, I'm going to explain how the question should have been asked so that you'll better understand the concept that you're asking a question about. This is a constant struggle, right? Like, people have genuine interest in having something they don't fully understand explained better to them. They can't fully understand it in the status quo, even people who are perfectly well intentionally equipped, because there's so much noise in the data stream, right? People understandably, naturally, correctly think I should seek information from multiple sources, because that allows me to use my own epistemology to determine what's correct with a broader set of data to analyze. But unfortunately, that backfires every time in cognitive functions, because everything but the correct interpretation is misleading, confusing noise in the data stream that will only make people less, not more, convinced about the singular accuracy of this map of reality. So I guess I'll stop this video here and upload this one, and I'll make another one pretty soon.